One last thing to think about in this opening is that, okay, we're doing a recap. So knight f6, e5, knight c6, queen a4, knight d5, queen b3, and knight c7. So we're looking at this. And one more thing that had to be said is that probably during the video you've been arguing why the knight never took in e5. So let's talk about it. So as mentioned, the move now is knight g5 and is threatening checkmate. So here you can think it's already possible to take the pawn because the knight is not only winning a pawn but also protecting f7. This is now met by bishop f4 anyway, and the idea is to take the knight, and we have now access to the square f7. So if the knight is just protected, for example, then you can just take it and you are going to have access to f7. So the knight will have to move, and when he moves, then you can take the pawn. And this cannot be stopped because you see f6 or h6. So h6, you just take the knight, it comes with an attack on the rook. So if you lose the knight, you take the rook, you're completely winning. If instead black plays f6, same thing, because the pawn cannot take the bishop since you will be able to go to f7. And so after taking the knight, the same thing happens. In this position, black will play e6. And as we mentioned, we play knight e4 with the idea of f7 and, knight f6, bishop g5. And in the video, we went through bishop g7 and also h6, but we never went through knight takes pawn in e5. Okay, again, bishop to f4 attacking the knight. Now, how can this be defended? White has an advantage already. If the knight goes back, for instance, then you give a check. And here the situation looks terrible, and you can refer to all the other examples you've seen during the videos to figure out what to do after king e7. If black takes, then you have this familiar situation where the king is completely stuck. He can't move anywhere, and it's impossible for him to castle anytime unless he wants to block with knight e7, for example. But here's a famous pattern that you all need to know by heart. In this situation, queen c3 is a thing, right? It's a famous fork. You're going to win material. So in this situation, we were thinking, can the knight be defended? So let's say d6. That's no good because you can just take the knight. Pawn takes back, and now bishop check gives white a great advantage. So if black blocks with the bishop, then you take. And queen cannot take back because knight f6 wins the game. So king will have to take back. But you can already tell things are looking really bad. Knight c3 with the idea of playing long castle and win the game straight away. Best move according to the engine by black is king to c8. But anyway, it's a very pleasant game for white to play after castling, and even if black were to play the most aggressive moves here, you have to figure out how to continue the game. You've got an incredible advantage. So let's say f5, don't get scared, and just play rook f to d1, finishing development, and after the queen moves, you'll be able to place the knight in d6, for instance. If the queen goes all the way to h4, try to push the pawns. The least black can do is try to get aggressive, because then here you just play queen c4, you're completely winning. The threat of knight d6, winning the queen, or simply to pile up and put pressure on the knight. So in this situation, this was check. What happens if the knight takes? Then check by taking with the queen. And now again, queen f7 will be met by knight fork. So after bishop blocks, queen takes pawn, attacking the rook. If the rook moves, then knight f6 wins the rook. If black plays the best move, the only move, which is f6, then you can take. And after the king moves to f7, you take the bishop, queen takes back. And now taking the rook is wrong because bishop b4 check and you lose the queen. So white continues with knight d2. And you go to a very comfortable endgame. There's not much for black. If black plays bishop g7 to develop with the tempo, so just queen f4 check. And after the king moves, long castle. Position is evaluated about +3 or something. In this position, we went through d6 and realized it was wrong. So what happens after the very natural bishop g7? Okay, then now check. And after king f8, knight to c3, and white is already better. As mentioned before, you should just refer to this entire series from the first to this very episode of how to beat the hyper accelerated dragon to see more or less how the patterns go. As you've seen, there's like a million traps and they all look very similar to each other. So let's have a look at something we haven't seen so far, like knight e8, trying to challenge the control that this knight is imposing on the black territory. Now here you just support it with knight to e4. And white's situation is perfect. Queen to c7, for instance, if black was, just to make an example, if black wants to double up the attack on the knight, then we just castle long and that knight is very safe in there. So black cannot develop the light square bishop by pushing the d6 pawn, d7 pawn pretty much ever. So what happens after the b6? Now queen to g3, double attack on the knight, threatening, if knight moves, threatening to move the knight from d6 with a bishop attacking the queen. It's deadly. Black's defending the knight with the pawn. Looks like he can still hold things, but you can just take. The pawn takes back, queen f3 check. King g8 runs into checkmate, so king e7. Still, same thing, it's a terrible game. Queen check, and then king moves in now. The knight is the only defender of the bishop, so you're just going to take it. And either way, you're going to win the bishop.